Hey, Chinese debate. Let's talk about overviews, something every debater should be giving in every single round. As always, we start with the basics. An overview summarizes an argument that you read in a previous speech. So, for example, if you're in the 2NC and you're about to argue a disadvantage you just read, you give an overview. So when do I read that overview? Well, as the name implies, it occurs at the beginning. It's over. It is a high-level view of the argument. So if you've watched our roadmap video, you understand that you will go through arguments in a sequence. When you get to, say, a disadvantage, the first thing you should give is an overview. And then you go on to address the other arguments that your opponents have made. So why should I do this? The big reason is to, A, persuade the judge about the overall point of your argument. We spend a lot of time in policy debate going back and forth on individual components of an argument, and sometimes we fail to take a step back and try and sell the judge and persuade the judge on the bigger picture of an argument as a whole. An overview is an opportunity for you to do that. The second, and probably more basic reason, is it's a great way to refresh the judge's mind. Remember, there's going to be multiple speeches, cross-examinations in between when, say, you read a position in the first negative constructive and then you begin extending and explaining that position in the negative block, or vice versa between the 2AC and the 1AR. So it's a great way to refresh the judge's recollection by giving an overview. So before I move on to how you give one, let me point out where. It's not on the screen, but where do I give an overview? You give an overview for advantages if you're affirmative, disadvantages, topicality, counterplans, and critiques if you're negative. Or to put it another way, all off-case positions that the negative reads should get an overview. So, how do I give an overview? Well, the basics are, it's a 20 to 30 second summary of a position that explains how the various parts of an argument come together. And we're going to take a look at some specific examples. But let me give you kind of a three-step guide in drafting overviews, because these should all be done before you ever step foot inside a round. You have three goals when you write an overview. The first is to explain the thesis of your argument. This can include explaining what you want the judge to know about the details of each part of your argument. So, for example, disadvantages have three parts. You can explain all those parts. You can talk about what does your evidence say and why does that prove the thesis of your argument. Or you can talk about what the keys to understanding and winning your argument are. Second, you've got to tell the judge why the argument matters. If you have read an argument that has an impact, and frankly all of them do, explain in detail how the impacts occur and why those impacts matter more than the other team's claims. For example, when you read a disadvantage, you need to explain why the judge should vote negative to avoid the disadvantage versus voting affirmative. Third, you've got to explain to the judge how he or she should evaluate the round, or as some people call it, how to frame the round for the judge. You want the judge to evaluate the arguments in a round similar to the way that you are evaluating the arguments in a round. So explain how the judge should do that. For example, what types of arguments should the judge find important? What arguments should the judge find unimportant? And how should the judge compare those arguments in a round? And this goes hand in glove with the idea of explaining why the argument matters. If you explain why the argument matters and then explain why, because it matters so much, that provides a lens for the judge to view the debate, you're setting yourself up for success. So let's take a look at a couple of overviews. So this is a Word document where we're going to find just about all the arguments that we make in debate. And as you can see from the header, this is an example of a pre-prepared overview. This overview comes from the arms sales topic and is specific to the alliance's disadvantage. Now, you've if you're listening to this and didn't debate that topic, you have no idea what that argument is. But if this overview does its job, you should be able to get an understanding. So let's read it, and then let's break it down. It says, and this is what you would read in a round, the United States system of defensive alliances is under strain because of the Trump administration's view that the U.S. is paying too much to help our allies. But the alliances persist. That's our Friedman evidence. But ending arms sales undermines a key way to reassure our allies that the U.S. remains committed to their defense. This doubt undermines alliances, increasing the risk of global conflict and war. That's our Cade-Now Benaim evidence. All right. So if you remember back, we just talked about one of the things that you can utilize an overview for, and this is essentially walking the judge through the constituent parts of a disadvantage. It talks about the status quo, the uniqueness. It talks about the link argument, decreasing arms sales undermines our ally efforts. And then it talks about the impact arguments. And it cites the specific evidence that's in the first negative speech. So that's a good job of explaining the thesis of the argument. Now, this overview isn't perfect, and nothing is, which is why we practice, we rewrite, and we get better. This overview could benefit from explaining why the argument matters a little more, explaining the impact argument. There's a reference to global conflict and war, but there really isn't a way to compare that or quantify that in terms of the other arguments in the debate. Likewise, there is not an attempt to frame the round for the judge and explain how the judge should prioritize this argument. So we can improve upon this overview. But let's take a look at another overview. This one related to topicality. Topicality substantial is something that you can read just about every single topic. So let's read it and break it down. Begins with, our opponents aren't topical. Substantial means considerable or significantly great. This is our Merriam-Webster's dictionary evidence. Our opponents don't fall under this interpretation. This is bad for two reasons. One, we lose ground. We lose any specific links to disadvantages that hinge off actual policy changes because they will just dodge out of it, claiming they are too small to cause anything. Two, predictability. The negative can't prepare for an AF outside of the resolution. This means we can't research the AF, develop arguments, and therefore can't effectively argue against them. This means the odds are stacked against the neg before the round even starts. Don't let this happen. Vote neg to stop the destruction of fairness. Let's go to the line by line. Now, this overview does a lot of the things that the previous overview didn't do. For example, it talks about why the argument matters. It outlines the impact arguments in great detail and talks about how the affirmative not being topical doesn't allow for a fair playing field for the negative. It explains how the judge should evaluate that argument, essentially vote neg, stop the destruction of fairness, as this is written. Now, what this overview could do better is explaining why the affirmative plan doesn't fit within the meaning of substantial. There's a good job of explaining the definition, but there isn't a great job of explaining why it fits within the word or doesn't fit within the word substantial. But it does a lot of other things really, really well. So these are just a couple examples of what overviews can look like. You'll find a host of examples on the Dropbox, and you can work with me or other varsity members to take a stab at drafting your own overviews, and then we can work to make them the best they can be.